Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet, in alliance with Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals.
Our guest on Off the Cuff today, one of our most thoughtful and prolific writers. When I say our, I say India's, but also globally acknowledged, globally respected, globally debated. Globally trolled, I don't know. I think I get enough trolling for everybody within India. For all my friends, I draw that fire. So Amitav, wonderful to have you on Off the Cuff. And as you might have figured, that I'm dealing with a little bit of my pre-Diwali sniffles. Please don't think that this is something that I can transmit to you. This is just need a chick pill at some point because the Delhi air quality goes really bad before Diwali.
Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you today. And I have my share of pre-Diwali sniffles as well. So I may have to mute myself every now and again because just to clear my throat.
That's perfectly fine. But you know, when we have you talking, we don't have to do any throat clearing. In the sense of that metaphor. And I was reading up on what you've been saying, what you've been writing, and what's being written. And I saw your interview with Lit Hub last night. And I found that to be the most perceptive of them all. And let me start with something. I'll get on to what is the metaphor, etc. But you do all this writing, climate change, the fact that we humans have brought ourselves to this pass. Do you get the sense sometimes that nobody listens, or you get the sense that people are listening and this is making a change?
Well, I can't, when I first started writing about these things, I really had the sense that nobody was listening. And certainly I also, within the writers community, people thought I was crazy to be interested in, to be writing about these kinds of things. But I think there's been a very significant change, in the last few years. At this point in time, really, we can all see with our own eyes what's happening. And, recently, I think it was the municipal commissioner, someone in Mumbai who said,
right.
A large part of Mumbai is going to be underwater by 2050.
He's a very smart guy, Iqbal Chahal, I'm confused with. Another former IAS officer. And he's the one who got the COVID situation in control in Mumbai very well.
That's very interesting to know. Yes, Mumbai certainly has handled it much better. This particular pandemic, it's handled much better than other cities. As you know, Mumbai, generally speaking, is a better run city than most of our cities,
Less worse than Delhi. Anything is...
Yes.
So now do you get the sense that people are listening, or are enough people listening?
Yes, I think people are listening, and I think sometimes one has to try and do these things a little differently. So, a few years ago, the Godrej Group, they're very big in real estate in Mumbai, as you know. They invited me to talk to their group. And I think the Godrej Group really is an unusual sort of organization.
They are very sensitive to all these concerns.
They're very far-seeing. And, they've preserved 10,000 acres of mangrove forest.
Yes, right.
On the edge of Mumbai. They could sell that land for, I don't know how many billions. But they've actually preserved it. It's a really remarkable thing if you consider, in comparison with other industrial houses, which are just busy destroying forests at an incredible rate. So they asked me to speak to their organization. And, I actually thought, how do I explain the gravity of the situation to these people? And so what I ended up doing is that I wrote a short story and I made a sort of short video putting together all kinds of things. And really, it had quite an impact. Firoza Godrej, who's a friend of mine and also a very sort of brilliant person, when I'd finished, she said that she was going to take it forward and try and, do some disaster planning and so on. And so in one way or the other, I do think that it's had some impact,
Yes, it's quite a sight. It's quite a stunning sight. In fact, if you go over that Eastern Expressway in Bombay, you can see it to your right. It just
Yeah.
spreads like that. And I also marvel, how did it survive in Mumbai? And to know that this is private property, and yet
That's
it's
right.
allowed to survive, it takes some doing. But what about the governments? What about the establishments? They still go on arguing about this and that. Where do you place the debate right now globally?
Well, what I would say really is that every government around the world has learned the language of greenwashing. Pretending to do things while at the same time, in a different way, just undoing everything, really. And this is true around the world. I mean, you look at Justin Trudeau. On the one hand, he talks a lot of greenwashing talk and seems very woke and so on. But at the same time, he's allowing more and more exploration for fossil fuels.
Yeah.
It's a similar situation over here. But I think it's in many ways particularly bad in India, I must say. Because, on the one hand, there are people the government talks a lot about climate and so on, climate change. But, just the most basic fundamental things, like this coastal highway that they're building in Mumbai. It's absolutely mad. I mean, anybody can see that, sea level rise will completely threaten this coastal highway. Indeed, I mean, even as Mumbai stands today, I mean, as this commissioner said, I mean, half of it is going to be underwater. In the middle of this, building this highway, it just makes no sense at all to my mind.
Yeah, but India has other paradoxes. For example, Prime Minister Modi and Nitin Gadkari, the Transport Minister, Highways Minister, they've been talking about this massive conversion to electric vehicles. But at the same time, we've just seen the situation that's been highlighted by the coal shortage, that our power production is still nearly 70% dependent on coal, despite all the advances we might have made in renewables. 70% is a lot. And China is not much better.
Yeah, neither India nor China. I mean, there's a heavy dependence on coal. This is the most easily available fossil fuel in both India and China. So both India and China are very dependent on them. But we can't forget, actually, that, this is also the case in many other parts of the world. I'm not sure what exactly the figures are for the United States or for Germany, for that matter. But that enormous dependence on coal remains across the planet, and But I would say it's certainly that I'm sure you've been to China and seen they've moved very fast towards electric vehicles. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. I mean, when you're there. Even the scooters and all those electric bicycles and so on, it's incredible. And look at the number of Chinese companies that are now competing with Tesla, for electric vehicles. It's really remarkable.
Also, they've cleaned up the air around their cities really brilliantly. I mean, I remember Beijing. I think I first went there in 1986. So I remember sniffing Beijing air then, and now it's another place.
It's absolutely incredible. I remember Guangzhou, like 20 years ago, when I first went there. You would never see the sun, and then 10 years later, the skies were clear. It's really amazing what they've succeeded. Whereas, I don't need to tell you this. You're in Delhi. You can see what an environmental disaster Delhi has become.
Yeah, and Delhi has peculiar problems that we know. We know that around this time, inversion of air takes place. So something has to be done at a very massive scale to control many things. It will still not be the best air in the world for 6 weeks, but it can be a lot better than what it is. So the big ideological or sort of nationalistic debate, or debate that comes from national interest, that see these big powers, see these rich countries, America, Europe, now even China, they emit so much carbon, they consume so much carbon per person. They are the ones who should be cutting. Why are you stopping countries, really poor countries like India, which are just moving up the value chain a little bit. Why should we pay the price for the excesses done by others? So that is where the debate gets stuck. And I see a lot of our Hindi press, for example, and I see this is an argument that people find very persuasive.
What you're saying is absolutely true, Shekhar. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's not just India. If you go to Indonesia, China, wherever, and you talk about climate change, immediately this is exactly what people will say. And that's really the enormous difference between the way that climate change is perceived in the West and how it's perceived by the rest. In the West, it's seen primarily as a technocratic problem that can be fixed through technology and so on. But anywhere you go outside the West, climate change is fundamentally perceived as a geopolitical problem, as a problem of inequality, which is exactly what you're speaking about. And I think that is really where this thing becomes such a difficult issue. Because, the geopolitics of climate change is never discussed. It's never discussed at any of the COP meetings. All those meetings are purely sort of oriented towards, technocratic and technological solutions. Nobody ever talks about the geopolitics of it. And I think that is really the sticking point,
Because unless you fix the geopolitics, you can't have a tech solution, because the answer to the tech solution is fantastic. We know there are tech solutions. These cost a lot of money. Why should I be pulling out that money to spend when you are the ones who consume? I mean, look at a place like, say, Qatar. Qatar consumes more carbon or emits more carbon per human being at a rate of about 16 or 70 times of a country like India.
Yes, it's true of Qatar, it's true of Saudi Arabia, it's true of the Emirates. I mean, the rate at which they've expanded their carbon footprint is absolutely astonishing. And it is genuinely astonishing because, look, they don't have water. They don't have fresh water. So what do? They manufacture fresh water from, through these various processes. And what do they use that fresh water for? It's to create parks and lawns. It's completely mad. Why do they need parks and lawns? It's the same thing, I think, when I'm in Delhi. Delhi is running out of water. We know groundwater in Delhi is going to be exhausted very soon. And yet, every day, all those trees and lawns are watered in Delhi. It makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah. So the question then is that poorer countries say, all right, we'll take technologies, but you can't win in every way. That you say technology is the solution. You will not make a sacrifice. Then we should get technology. You have the technology, we buy it from you. So we pay you more money. So if you say that this is a world without borders and all of us are in it together, then why don't you put some money on the table?
That's absolutely true. I mean, look, at the Paris Agreement, it was agreed that they would create a fund of 100 billion, that the rich countries would contribute 100 billion to try and mitigate climate change in the most vulnerable nations. Not even 10 billion of that turned up,
And then came Trump.
Yes, and they've repeatedly, look, there's no doubt the United States has repeatedly undermined, every kind of climate agreement, going back to what happened in, right to the start in Rio, then the Kyoto Protocol. But it's not just the United States, it's actually the Anglosphere in general. I mean, it's Australia, the United States, Canada, and often the UK as well. I mean, those are the countries which are, in a way, hegemonic today. And they've been absolutely unbending. What can one say?
So that theme comes across in your book as well, the latest one, Nutmeg, Scarce, where you say that the largest degree of climate change denial comes from countries which are sort of settler colonialist countries, because they think that they are entitled to the resources.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, these countries have been built on extractivist economies. I mean, basically, the United States, Canada, Australia, they're fundamentally built on extractivist practices, coal mining. Australia, it's coal. In the United States, it's always been oil, natural gas. But I think, the thing that we don't really talk about really is, in effect, another aspect of the geopolitics, which is defense expenditure. That's the really striking thing. I mean, the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, the single institutional emitter, the largest institutional emitter is the Pentagon, which is responsible for 20% of the United States greenhouse gas emissions. During this whole Iraq thing,
that's a stunning piece of data. I mean, I wasn't aware of this.
And actually, it's probably much, much more, because that doesn't even take into account, defense manufacturing and so on. And I wouldn't be surprised if half of the US's greenhouse gas emissions came from defense-related activities. So now defense expenditure is never discussed at any of the COP meetings. It was actually excluded going back to Kyoto. It was, the United States again took the lead in that. It excluded any discussion of defense expenditure. So, we should not be fooled by this. They may speak of it as a technocratic and technological issue, but fundamentally, it's like what it's always been. It's an issue of power. It's a power relation between various countries.
So what changes between Trump and Biden?
Well, as you can see right now, I must say, after the 2020 election, I thought, oh my God, at least I'll be able to go back to watching the news, because that had become almost impossible in the Trump era. But it's again, we see complete stalemate. One single senator is really holding up all the climate solutions that Biden has been speaking about. Certainly, I would say, having Biden there is in many ways a huge change, a hugely positive change in so many ways. But again, we see really that, the United States as a political system is in many ways really very dysfunctional at this point.
At least you have somebody who's not a climate change denier right now. That's
right. But again, did Trump did he really believe that climate change was a hoax? I doubt it, because he's been taking out insurance for his properties in Miami and in Scotland and so on. Right. So, when they say that climate change is a hoax, you have to understand what they're actually saying, which is
they're playing to their gallery.
They're playing to their gallery, exactly. And, sadly, I think what a lot of right-wing Westerners, what they're really waiting for is what they call a Malthusian correction, which is that they're waiting for a lot of poor people to die. That's the horrible reality.
That's a very extreme thing to say. You believe it?
I absolutely. If you follow the discourse, it's completely evident. Why do they harp so much on population? They constantly talk about a Malthusian correction. It's very much within the discourse. And when I say that they're waiting for a lot of poor people to die, it's not just poor people in Asia or whatever, or Africa. Even here, even in the United States, there are these huge sacrifice zones, where basically it's Black and indigenous people who are in the way of disaster.
So the logic is, some people have earned the right to live on. Some people don't deserve to. They haven't earned it.
Yes. I get those emails every day, from angry denialists, basically just saying exactly that.
What is the nastiest or the most fun thing you've been told by climate change deniers?
Well, I wouldn't say that any of it is fun, but most of it is like, you should just shut up, and you don't deserve to speak, because if it weren't for us, you wouldn't be you wouldn't be anything, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's just constant trolling. You must come across it all the time. So
yes, but Trump, you are right. Trump was also doing it to entertain. When you had this big snowstorm in North America, he said temperatures are these, snow everywhere, global warming, ha ha ha. I mean, that was to entertain. But when these people entertain, they also have an influence over public opinion because people think the president is talking.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. I mean, and we should not deceive ourselves on these issues. A very large part of the population, whether it be in the United States or in Europe or in Australia or any of these countries, a very large part of the population actually wants nothing to be done. Literally, the United States has been built so much on oil that it's almost impossible to live in most of the United States without being completely dependent on the automobile. That's exactly how these cities have been designed. It's complete car dependence. Unfortunately, we in India have also followed that model, especially in Delhi. Basically, it's Kolkata, Mumbai, and Chennai are not as car dependent as Delhi, but Chennai is becoming increasingly so. But Mumbai, at least you can manage with public transport. In Delhi, it's become much more difficult to do that.
Yeah, and Americans must also have, just as they have the right to bear arms, they have the right to cheap oil, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's very much a part of the whole thing about being American. Oil is completely sort of tied into the national identity of the United States. It's so profoundly enmeshed with identity issues here.
Your latest book, Nutmeg, which I think in Hindi is called Jaifal.
Jaifal, yeah.
A lot of the households use it, a little bit of it. Jaifal, Javitri, so Jaifal. We've all heard of the resource curse. How did Nutmeg emerge as your metaphor for the resource curse? How did you make that discovery and how did it happen?
Well, it happened literally by traveling to this place, the Banda Islands. The nutmeg tree was endemic to the Banda Islands. Nobody knows where the Banda Islands are today because they're in the far east of Indonesia, really, very far away.
They're just about 12 kilometers by 7 kilometers or something.
That's right. Yeah. It's a tiny archipelago, but until the 18th century, every single nutmeg on earth grew in the Banda Islands. And really, when Vasco da Gama and all the navigators, when they came into the Indian Ocean, it's true that they came to India first, but what they were really looking for was the Spice Islands, which are in Indonesia. And they went there as quickly as they could. And from the beginning, they had just this one plan, which was to impose a monopoly of certain spices. And the Dutch took it to its ultimate extreme. And in 1621, they sent a fleet to the Banda Islands, and they basically just massacred every single Bandanese. I mean, they drove a few managed to escape, but the rest were either killed or enslaved. It's the most ghastly story. It's one of the first early modern genocides. And what is so ghastly about it is that it was all because of a tree. This unbelievably wonderful tree, the nutmeg tree. But the nutmeg tree brought disaster upon the Bandanese, just like the clove tree, which was endemic to another part of the Spice Islands, of the northern Spice Islands, Maluku Utara, as they call it. that also brought disaster on those islands, but not to the degree to which it happened in the Banda Islands. And I think for me, it was very important to see it in this way. I mean, going there really taught me something about the way the world is. Because, these great gifts that the earth gives us, the way that we have abused them, the way that the world has abused them, and this was completely led by European colonizers, in the 17th and 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. These became absolute curses. And we see this curse most of all now in relation to oil. Look at Iraq. Iraq has basically been destroyed by the resource curse. Similarly, we can see in India, you may know I wrote these 3 books called the IBIS trilogy,
Yes.
which has a lot to do with actually the opium cultivation by the British in India. And as you know, opium was largely grown by the British in Purvanchal.
To be sold into the Chinese forcibly.
That's right. To be forcibly sold to the Chinese. And that's the curse that opium has put on our relations with China. Really, we don't often recognize it. But most of all, it has put a curse on Purvanchal. The backwardness of this entire region, Bihar and Eastern UP, is completely traceable to opium. There are many studies which show you, the ways in which opium became a resource curse for Bihar. Just think about it. Historically, this region, Purvanchal, was the richest, most prosperous part of India. This is where all the great empires were, the Mauryas, the Guptas, everything. How is it that within 100 years, this became the poorest, most backward part of our nation? And really, it's completely traceable, to opium. So to this day, actually, you can see that, the resource curse hangs upon so many parts of our country. We can see with uranium mining in Jharkhand, we can see with coal mining. This curse is spreading across the planet incredibly fast. It's exactly as Mahatma Gandhi said, we are devouring the earth like locusts.
Well, people ask very often that how come only dictatorial regimes have oil or Islamic dictators have oil? And the answer to that is that oil gives dictators a wherewithal to sustain themselves because they can bribe their people with it and do their own stuff. And
Absolutely. But, there have been studies which also show that oil is very much connected to religious fundamentalism. And not just in the Middle East. It's certainly no coincidence that Saudi Arabia has sponsored, Islamic extremism in so many parts of the world. But we also see that, even in Norway, oil comes from areas where there's the most sort of evangelical fundamentalism. It's also true in the United States. You see across the United States, wherever there is oil, there is also this kind of religious fundamentalism.
Why?
So, sorry?
Why? We know that there is a correlation, but what's the cause?
I can't explain it, but it goes back really, to the very beginnings of this. There is a sort of distinct connection between, generally sort of right-wing thinking, but also religious extremism in relation to oil. Or, we think that these things, oil, for example, or take opium, whatever, that they are inert, that they played no active role in human life. But in fact, we have become slaves of these things. We have become slaves of fossil fuels. Just take another example. 30, 40 years ago, just in terms of geopolitics, would anyone have said to you that these tiny Middle Eastern kingdoms, like Qatar or the Emirates, that they would become major geopolitical players? Yet you look at it now, those kingdoms have their fingers in every geopolitical pie, no matter whether it's Afghanistan or Kashmir or India-Pakistan disputes or Syria. It's these tiny countries that are now literally running a large part of the geopolitics of the world. And in fact, more than any other place, they've figured out the United States and the United Kingdom. They know how to manipulate the United States and the United Kingdom better than almost anybody else. So, the enormous geopolitical power that these countries have accumulated is a real issue. It's a real issue going forward.
Yeah, I will also take some questions from our subscribers and my colleagues also. So he just talked about IBIS trilogy. So there is Iqbal from Infosys who's asking a question on that. And he says, given a chance to choose to write a book, which topic would you prefer, historical or science fiction, IBIS or Calcutta chromosome? And he says, I am myself conflicted as to which I like more.
Well, I've loved science fiction. I love reading science fiction. I think science fiction today is the most relevant domain of literature, honestly. Yes, I mean, science fiction is very interesting to me. But honestly, I feel that at this moment, all I really want to write about is the reality of the world that surrounds us, because that itself is like science fiction, in some way.
Yeah. Ashok Lavasa, who's a former finance secretary, also former election commissioner, he says, given that the problem of climate change is real, what are the realistic solutions for dealing with it, especially when those who are vulnerable might not be adequately equipped to deal with it? And those who are historically responsible neither accept their responsibility nor do what is possible in their means to tackle it. We talked about some of it earlier.
Well, first of all, let me say that it's a great pleasure to be in dialogue, so to speak, with Mr. Lavasa, who, is such a distinguished man. In terms of impacts, I know that we are always talking about the vulnerable being particularly impacted, but I don't think that's actually a realistic portrayal of people who are likely to be the worst impacted. I think that the people who are going to be worst impacted by climate change, in fact, are urban middle class people. You just take the imaginary situation of a cyclone hitting Mumbai. If a cyclone were to hit Mumbai, and it's going to happen, sooner or later, as we know, the evacuation procedures are the only thing that can save people. But we've seen this repeatedly. If people need to be evacuated from Mumbai, who will be evacuated? It's actually the working class people who will leave, because the working class people in Mumbai have deep connections with the surrounding countryside, with Ratnagiri district and so on. They know how to use the trains and so on, and they will leave. It's the middle class people who will be stuck in their houses, who will not want to leave, simply because all their wealth is concentrated, if you like, in real estate or in their cars and so on. They will not be able to leave, and they will be genuinely devastated. I think we see this pattern will unfold across India. Especially middle class people, their real estate holdings will be deeply threatened by patterns of climate change.
Bhuti Bhushan, who's also referring to one of your books, and says, do you think India is back in a similar place as the one described in your essay, The Ghosts of Mrs. Gandhi?
Well, that's a very difficult connection to draw, but because that was such a sort of horrifying event, and really it's resonated for me for years afterwards. But I think India is in a profound crisis right now. I think any of us can see that, and this crisis, it's not a reversible thing. I think we can see, when I look around the world today, the extreme political destabilization that we can see around the world, no matter whether it's Brexit or whether it was the Trump years or what we see happening in India now, we should not deceive ourselves. These things are profoundly connected to the planetary crisis. Everybody knows that the future is going to be much more difficult than the past.
Yeah. Satish NG, I think, is a budding writer. He says, can you elaborate on your writing process? How many revisions does your text go through? Do you type yourself, or dictate to an assistant? Do you have preferred hours for writing? Do your editors add value to your text? And if yes, any examples?
Well, I don't have any assistants. I do everything myself. I've never had assistants, even research assistants. So I do everything myself, all the reading, all the writing. And I work basically from 9 to 5. I get up in the morning, I go to my desk, I work straight through. I work straight through the day with a short break for lunch. And I write first by hand using a pencil, and then I write by pen, and then finally I do drafts on the computer. I would say no sentence that I've ever written has gone through less than 15 drafts. So I'm an obsessive sort of editor, drafter, corrector. And as for editors, yes, I think editors can add a lot of value. And I think writers sometimes think of the editing process as a kind of conflictual or combative process. And I don't think it has to be like that. Editors really want the best for the books that they publish. And they can be incredibly helpful. Their suggestions can be incredibly helpful. It's just one should consider oneself fortunate to have an editor, really, because it's another mind that's also applying itself to your work.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sandhya Ramesh, who's our science editor, lives in Bangalore, a much nicer city than where I live. She's asking, what are some lessons from colonialism that we've learned, which we should be applying while we explore places and resources outside of our planet now to settle on or to colonize, as some people say?
I think this idea of colonizing other planets, it's just a completely crazy thing. Just imagine this is a planet that we've already colonized, and we've done disastrous things to it. It was a rich, amazing planet filled with most extraordinary gifts, and what have we done to it? If we do actually colonize another planet, we would do exactly the same. But in any case, it's a crazy idea. These are the ways in which people are trying. I mean, it's a form of climate denialism,
Right.
all this talk about colonizing other planets. And who are the people talking about it? There are 2 or 3 billionaires, and why are they talking about it? The unstated assumption is that the earth will become unlivable and that the people who live here will all die. So this is the kind of, what can I say, Malthusian thinking that's behind this kind of these fantasies.
There's also fatalism. You try and postpone a problem because you don't want to look it in the eye. In your book, you make a very interesting comparison of invaders, conquerors. And this is something that will interest a lot of people. It interested me immediately. That you said that Genghis Khan actually wasn't such a bad conqueror compared to the European colonialists later.
Well, but what can you say? The European colonization of the Americas resulted in the death in these enormous mass mortality events, where between 80 to 90% of the people died. And they like to say that it was all because of disease, but no, it wasn't. It was because of violence, because of colonial violence, that you had these incredible mass mortality events. And these nowhere that Genghis Khan went did 80 or 90% of the people die. He fought armies, and yes, he was. Humans have always been violent. Wars have always happened, but nowhere that Genghis Khan went did 80 to 90% of the people die. Nor did he exterminate flourishing civilizations. It is absolutely not the case that Genghis Khan, destroyed civilization. On the contrary, they were very quick to adapt. I mean, the Mongols themselves were sort of like proto-Buddhists, as you know. But within 2 generations, Genghis Khan's one grandson was the Shia ruler of Iran. Another grandson was the Taoist ruler of China.
Right.
They were incredibly adaptable. They adapted very, very quickly. So, what the European conquest of the Americas inaugurates is a completely new chapter in human history. It's violence on a scale that had never in human history occurred before.
And that conquest was not about ambition of taking my flag everywhere. That was about plundering the resources.
It was exactly that. It was, plundering, gold, silver in the Americas, most of all, or for that matter, spices, for which the Bandanese were exterminated. And the Bandanese extermination occurred because Europeans at that point had grown used to these exterminatory wars in the Americas. There's an absolutely direct connection. We cannot forget that, this was the inaugurative phase, if you like, of colonialism.
But it also tells me how little we know that nutmeg had become so valuable that for a few fistfuls you could buy a ship or a house.
Yes, Yes, absolutely. And let's not forget that the first British colony in Asia was not in India. It was in the Banda Islands, a tiny little island called Run. I mean, I visited it. You can't believe it. It's just this tiny island, which ultimately ended up being exchanged for Manhattan. Because the Banda Archipelago at that point was more valuable to the Dutch than New England.
Yeah. So again, Sandhya Ramesh wants to know, do you think reparations are due now to communities that got plundered?
Well, of course, reparations are due to, I mean, if the world were a just place, many kinds of reparations would be due to many, many people. I mean, they would be due to how much did the British take away from India? I mean, it's in today's money, it's several trillion pounds. Are reparations going to happen? Well, we can hope.
Yeah. Well, that may or may not happen. But the British, which school are you from? One school says the British only took from India, gave India nothing or very little. One school, I think even Dr. Manmohan Singh would say that the British also gave India a lot. So what is the balance sheet like to you?
I must say, when I read that speech of Dr. Manmohan Singh's, it really made me cringe. I mean, I thought, what is he talking about? And what is the whole thing about the British giving? I think this idea is itself founded on the profound self-hatred that we came to absorb during the colonial era. The Maratha, I mean, you look at the early, the rulers who were displaced by the British. They were all extremely progressively minded, actually. If you take the Marathas, they were very innovative. They were keeping their armies on the cutting edge. The Duke of Wellington, when he was asked about his most decisive battles, they were actually in India, because the Marathas were very innovative, and they were certainly staying in touch with all the latest technological developments in that period. So who is to say that I mean, look at Thailand. Thailand managed to innovate. Is Thailand because they were not colonized, they've managed to do much better than all their neighbors. You can see what colonialism does when you go to the borders of Burma and Thailand. Burma was once one of the richest countries in Asia, and you look at Burma today, it's completely devastated. And you look at Thailand, which has managed perfectly well, or you look at Japan, which also managed to escape colonialism.
But a lot of the Indian rich went to Burma to make more money.
They did.
In our own folklore, even Bollywood folklore, mere piya gaye Rangoon, wahan se kiya hai telephone, because Rangoon was a place to go to.
Yes, and we should also acknowledge that Indians acted like colonialists in Burma, which is a part of the whole problem that Burma has today. That many Indians acted in a very colonial fashion in Burma. So that is also a part of our history, that we need to acknowledge.
So Nayanima Basu, who's our diplomatic correspondent, she has a question on Myanmar. She says, what are your thoughts on present-day Myanmar? Since you've written an excellent book, The Glass Palace, what are your thoughts on the present-day Myanmar and the coming back of the military junta there?
It's an absolute tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy. I must say, 10 years ago when I went to Burma, it was run by the NLD, and the NLD is not by any means perfect. We know that it's been very oppressive towards certain minorities and so on. But still, at that moment, 10 years ago, I can't tell you what a difference there was between the late 90s Burma and Burma in let's say 2010. It just seemed like this incredible flowering. There were, writers were writing. There was, for a brief moment, incredible freedom of speech and so on. And now, when you look at it, it's just reverted to an even worse version of what it was in the 90s. And I think, again, these problems in Burma are probably irreversible. Burma's been dealing with 16 insurgencies since independence. And I don't think this problem is going to be solved.
Bismi Taskin, again, my young colleague, she wants to know what will it take for Indian politicians to make climate change part of their agenda, like make it seriously part of their manifestos or their offering to the voter.
It shouldn't be that difficult, really, just in terms, let's say, in terms of resilience. I think it's perfectly possible that governments across India, that political parties across India should just start talking about it. And indeed, I must say, to his great credit, Uddhav Thackeray has been talking about it, And I think as time goes on, these issues will become more and more important in relation to political parties and politicians. We should not deceive ourselves. Even this farmers' agitation, in Punjab and Haryana, behind it lies environmental factors. The Green Revolution, in fact, introduced patterns of agriculture into India which are not sustainable in the long run, and this is one of the issues.
Not even necessary, because nobody needs so much rice or wheat.
Exactly. And I'm sure you've seen this, Shekhar, but if you travel abroad now, the number of Punjabis who are actually just, escaping, the diaspora, it's astonishing.
Well, I write an occasional series called Writings on the Wall, and I travel through the country, travel across some part of the country and look at the walls. Yeah. And I noticed on the first of these travels in Punjab that all you can see is going to Canada, which is very often spelled as Kanada. There's even a Gurdwara there where people go, and the folklore is that if you go and present at the Gurdwara a miniature airplane model of an airliner, then Almighty will get you your visa and etc., and your immigration overseas. So this immigration is the most aspirational thing in Punjab right now.
Yes, and in fact, a lot of the, if you look at these migrants who are on the US border, the US-Mexico border, there's substantial numbers of South Asians in them. They never get talked about, but there's substantial numbers of South Asians also in the people who are crossing the Mediterranean and the Balkans into Europe. In fact, Bangladeshis are the second largest group, crossing the Mediterranean. Similarly, Pakistani Punjabis, but also many Indian Punjabis.
Many Indians. Bangladesh is going through a very troublesome phase right now, particularly with the rise of fundamentalism, these attacks on Hindus. Since you mentioned Bangladesh.
Yes, it's a terrible situation what's happening there. I'm myself from a family with roots in Bangladesh, so of course I pay close attention to this. And the extremism problem in Bangladesh has by no means disappeared. It's a horrible thing. It's going to, and the worst part is that going back to a book I wrote a long time ago, The Shadow Lines, these problems tend to mirror each other across the border. And that's what we are often seeing now. Basically, I do think that, we cannot have a liberal, secular polity. They used to say once upon a time that you can't have socialism in one country. The same way, I think you can't have liberalism in one country, unless we have liberalism across South Asia, it'll be very difficult to defend liberalism in India.
Otherwise, everybody starts following the worst possible example.
That's exactly right.
Some of that happening in India?
Very much so. I think that's exactly it. I mean, actually, the remarkable degree to which Hindu fundamentalists just want to be, in a way, exactly like Muslim fundamentalists. It's the bizarre situation that we are in.
Yeah. Now, Simran Surur, who covers environment for us, she's latched onto one quote from you where you say that nothing will help except degrowth. And she says it's a good idea, degrowth, but then how do you lessen poverty or eradicate poverty? How do you bring the poor into some kind of better quality of life if you have degrowth? How do you do it without growth?
Look, there are many paths to creating better conditions for people without the sort of growth that we've had in the past. Look, what is this growth that we are talking about? Since 1990 and the installation, if you like, of the Washington Consensus, the idea has been that really the most aspirational forms of life are American forms of life. That is, every family has to have 2 cars, fridges, air conditioners, and so on. So that has been the pattern of growth for a very long time. But we know that that is not sustainable. It simply cannot go on. I mean, if every Indian family were to have 2 cars and air conditioners and so on, I mean, the environment of India would collapse. We already know that India, the entire subcontinent, is pinned under a brown cloud of aerosols. So it's not really a question of a choice. The earth is forcing upon us certain choices that we have to make. Now, let's think about our own pasts. My grandparents didn't have 2 cars, air conditioners, or anything like that. I remember I grew up without air conditioners. Did I think of myself as poor? Did my grandparents think of themselves as poor? No, they didn't. Did ordinary Indians who lived in villages and so on think of themselves as poor? No. If you look at forest peoples, the middle class gaze says that they are poor because they eat certain kinds of things, they hunt in the forest and so on. Do they themselves think of themselves as poor? No, by no means. They don't. I mean, they have the wealth of the forest. The forest is itself their wealth. So what this pattern of growth that we are subscribing to today consists of is essentially forcing middle class lifestyles on ordinary people who never thought of themselves as poor until they began comparing themselves with middle class people. Is this a sustainable thing? I don't think it is sustainable in the long run.
Well, I mean, that deserves debate. So I'll let you go. But before I let you go, I'll ask you about something else. Since you talked about forest just now, Jungle Nama, and this beautiful rendition that Ali Sethi, my friends Jugnu and Najam's son, and Salman Toor have done. Ali's voice and Salman Toor's drawings. How did that project come about? And tell us something about it before I let you go.
Well, Jungle Nama, is an adaptation of a legend from the Sundarban. And it's a wonderful legend, and it's a legend which brings together, Hindus and Muslims and Indians and Bangladeshis, because across the Sundarban, all the people who live in the forest really subscribe to Bon Bibi and the legend of Bon Bibi. So it's a legend of ecological balance, if you like, of human needs being balanced with the needs of non-humans. So from the start, I wanted it to be a collaborative project. I wanted to have artwork. I wanted to have music, and it so happens that here in New York, we have a sort of COVID bubble, and Salman and Ali were a part of our COVID bubble, like Meera Nair and many others. We have a sort of South Asian kind of little world here, if you like. It's a sort of recreation of the old Hindustan, if you like. And fortunately, they were in my bubble, and we were able to collaborate, and it was a wonderful experience, really. I mean, both these guys are just phenomenally talented. I mean, Ali is just
absolutely, and I think more people in India have to experience this, and we'll do what we can about that. So, Amitav, thank you very much. I am so tempted.
Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for finding the time, and I learned so much from this conversation.
Thank you, Shekhar. It was a great pleasure for me.